I'm recording now, and we're going to get started. So we're talking about sound design today. And yeah, we're just going to kind of talk about how sound design is used in games. There's a whole group of sound design labs that are, just adding in sounds to the game. And we'll talk about why it's so important to have sound in games, and then look at a few examples. So in video games, sound is generally used to enhance immersion or the feeling of deep involvement in the game world by the player or the user. And so having sound in the game, we often don't really, notice the sound as much, or, some games really are based on sound and based on music and stuff like that, and involve that component into the game much more directly. Something like, Guitar Hero or Dance Dance Revolution or something like that. But in most games, we don't always focus on the sound, but it's really important to create that feeling of immersion that we're in this game world. If the game didn't have sound, we would really notice it, even if we don't notice when there is sound in the game as much. So with developing games, we might spend a lot more time on programming and creating art and designing levels. Certainly there are more labs in this class that are dedicated to those topics, because there's a lot that goes into those. But as far as the interactivity and the immersive experience of the game, sound is just as important as our graphics and all of our other components. So a few rules for sound effects. So a sound should generally result from any collision or interaction between objects that imitate real-world physics. And so in the sound, you'll see examples of that in the sound design lab, in the sound effects lab. But if something would create a sound in real life, like if two things collide, or if something explodes, or you fall off into a river or something like that, anything that would make a sound in real life, we want to have a sound effect equivalent in the game. Otherwise, it will break the character out of that immersive experience. Like if we have a bunch of sounds for the character walking and jumping, but then they run into something and there's no sound, it kind of breaks that spell of immersiveness that is created by having all these different components that fit together. Sound should also accompany any change in state in the game. And so that's something that's kind of covered more by the UI lab, but it's also something that is just like, every aspect of the game should have these sounds that kind of correlate with what's happening. So if you get a point, there should be a sound. If you get some cool like key or some power up or some magic spell, there should be a sound related specifically to that component of the game. So we want to reinforce all of the interactions, all of the state changes that happen as we're playing the game with sounds throughout the game experience. And then any user input. So clicking on buttons, with the mouse, or hitting keys to make selections on a menu, or dragging and dropping something, like all of these actions should have some sound that accompanies it to kind of help the user understand what's happening and confirm that things are working. So we're going to look at a few examples of how sound design has evolved in video games. And we're going to start with Pong from 1972. So we've already listened to a little bit of this. Let's rewind a little bit. And, very, very simple game. It has like basically just some lines and some numbers and a dot and a dotted line down the middle. And the sound is very simple too, but you'll see there are these different sounds that correlate with all the different parts of the game, like hitting the ball bouncing, getting a point, or losing. All of these different things have a different sound associated with them. So as you play the game, you could actually close your eyes and understand what's happening in the game just by listening to it. So we'll just listen to a little bit of this one. whoops. So there's just a few sounds in like the entire design of that game, but they communicate everything that needs to be communicated about what's happening in the game. So that's very early, 1972. Let's keep going. So a little bit later, 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog. You'll see that there's a lot of things that change. It still has a kind of similar style of sound, like the sort of 8-bit sound effect type sound, but there's a million new things that are happening. There's music that's constantly changing. Like you'll hear the music change from cutscenes to parts of the game to getting to different sections of the game. There's sound for every like item that you're picking up as you're going through as Sonic. There's all sorts of different sounds that are all layered on top of each other. So we'll watch a little bit of this one. So you can see a few things that are added in there. We have these like themes that play at various times. Like when you beat the level, there's a specific music that gets played, and when you transition into that in between level scene, the ring scene, there's another style of music that gets played. And then they all like the sound effects are also very similar to the quality of the music. So it all kind of layers together in a nice way. We can hear the sounds and how they correlate with what's going on in the scene, and we can also hear the music, and they sound like they're coming from the same place or like the same sort of like world of sound, but they don't overlap with each other. They're not conflicting with each other. When we have background music, especially that's very busy, we need to make sure that the sounds of the background music are distinct enough from what the sound effects are, that we aren't getting this kind of overlap of different sound spaces that are confusing to the player. And so Sonic is a really good example of that. It has, even though it's obviously a lot more of a sort of library of sounds and effects and stuff than what we hear in Pong, it's still a pretty limited palette, especially considering what we have today in video games. And they do a really good job of kind of having these different types of sounds in different spaces, so you always know what everything is. Nothing kind of overlaps or conflicts with each other. So that's a good example of 90s style video game sound design. So we're going to move a bit forward to 1998. And we're going to watch a pretty long clip of this just because this is Half-Life, which was obviously a big, very influential game. And the way that they use music and environmental sounds and all sorts of other sound effects all at the same time are really, really good. So I'm going to play a bit of this. I forget exactly how long it is, but I'm going to go through basically like a level or the end of one level into the next level. And the other thing that's really cool that you'll hear in this example is sometimes the sound cuts out almost completely and it's like silent. And so clearly the designers are very aware of the effect that the sound has on the game. And you can see that like sometimes the sound really sort of like gets more tense as you're about to enter a scene. So it's almost like a film in that it's really priming you for what's coming up in the game. So if you hear some tense sound, you kind of know that there's some challenge, some bad guys or some fight that you're running into. There's also a lot of like guns and stuff in this game, so that stuff is pretty loud. Sometimes it's kind of annoying, so I apologize for that component of it. But overall, the sound design in this game is really great. So I think just pay attention to how the sound is changing, and I think you'll be kind of impressed by how much they do with the different sound components in this game. So I'll try to skip through. There's a couple boring parts, but I think we have time. We can watch it. So yeah, we'll just get started. Okay, so that was a long excerpt, but there's so many things going on in there that are very cool. So I'll just try to point out a couple of them. So one of the things I really like about the way that they use sound in that game are there these moments where you can see the player is listening instead of just like running into a room and shooting everything and clicking all the buttons or whatever. The player's actually stopping somewhere and listening what's happening in the next room or in the next area. And there's that one part where the scientists are talking. There's another point where he's hearing that there's a battle going on between the sort of alien monsters and the army guys. And so the game is actually using sound as a part of its game mechanic. It's saying, you can figure out puzzles or solve parts of the game just by listening to the sound. So they use environmental sounds really well in that way. And it really emphasizes just like how many different environments there are in the game when the player is going underwater and going through all these tunnels and then in these open spaces where there's a lot of echo and stuff like that. You can hear how the sound effects are kind of reinforcing all of those different environments, and the sound really changes in all of those environments. So that's another way that they use sound to make the game more immersive. And then the way they use music, they use these kind of different thematic parts at very important parts of the game. Like when the player runs into that boss and this is a pretty quick walkthrough. So this player doesn't probably spend as much time fighting the boss as, I might if the first time I play or something like that. But you can hear there's a specific theme music that goes along with that boss. And when he leaves, it just goes away. And then there's another theme music that plays when he gets past, the end of that level. And so using all of those different components to kind of get the player into the game, music can really easily kind of connect with us emotionally, like by creating tension or playing, that song at the end that's kind of like more action-y, kind of celebratory sound that's happening there. And so there's all these different parts of the game where the sound is really adding a lot to the experience. So yeah, there's a million different things that kind of change as you're going through the game. And it's very cool use of sound. So yeah, let's keep going. There's a couple more examples. I didn't know that they use it for comedy. I'll have to try to check that out. So the next video I want to show is a playthrough of Braid. I mentioned Braid in the lecture on indie games, and it's a really just like unique platformer from 2007 by a developer named Jonathan Blow. It has kind of a unique focus on aesthetics and sound. And so it has a lot of the same mechanics that we're used to from platformers like Mario and other games, but this one is integrating time in a different way, and you can see in these examples how the sound is used to reinforce what's happening with the time. And if you take out the sound, you'll see that it really does, like, if the sound wasn't reinforcing what's happening with the time, you wouldn't actually be able to understand it, because it's taking something that's only visible spatially that wouldn't make sense to us, but it's communicating what's happening with time by reversing the sound. So it's a really cool and pretty use of sound to create a game mechanic. So let's watch a little bit of Braid. So you can get a sense of how sound is being used in Braid. The cool thing about Braid as well is that each level has kind of a different theme, and so the mechanics change, and so the sound changes as well. And so you can kind of hear the sound changing with the different themes. So another example more recently is the game Inside. I think this game has come up in class before at some point. I think somebody may have mentioned it. But Inside is like a very kind of moody, kind of stealth platformer type game. And you'll hear that the sound effects are a big part of the experience of the game, both by creating tension, but also by integrating everything that's kind of happening in the game. So let's listen to a bit of this one. So that's Inside, and one of the things I like about that game, even though it's not a rhythm game, the sound of the game design does kind of go along with the background music. So it creates immersiveness in that way, and kind of like blending in what's happening in the background music with what's happening in the environmental sounds. So those are some examples. Obviously not exhaustive. There's tons of great games for thinking about sound design, but those are just a few that I wanted to use as examples. So a couple more things to consider when we start making sounds for our own games. different types of sound effects. And so we kind of talked a little bit about these as far as where sounds go, but just kind of thinking if you want like a list of sounds that I have to make for my game, this is a good starting point. And of course, this is kind of reinforced by the sound labs as well. So for the player, you're going to have walking, jumping, attacking, dying. Those are kind of the main things. And they kind of go along with the animations if you've done the character animation lab that you have. So if you have an animation for some state, you probably want to have a sound effect that goes along with it too. For the character, so not just the player, but other characters in the scene, they have their own movement sounds, as well as their own attack and dying or death sounds. Game state changes. So as we talked about before, having, changing a level or going to a different scene. So beginning and ending of the level sounds or other changes of state in the game, like if you lose a life or something like that. Sounds for rewards. So if you collect a key, you should hear like some sound to go along with that, or some other type of achievement if you get some kind of like badge or you get a high score or something like that. And then there's all the UI sounds. So any button that you click, any menu item, when you pause the game, when you go to the next level, all of those things should have sounds that are triggered along with those changes in the state of the game. Beyond our sort of sound effects, we also have ambient sounds. So ambient sounds are not necessarily related to something changing in the game, but just giving us information about the environment. So we saw a lot of examples of that in the second two examples, or not second two, in the Half-Life and the Inside examples, not as much in the other ones. But ambient sounds are just telling us something about the environment that we're in. Is it raining outside, or is there somebody talking in the next room? Is there traffic? All of these different things can be ambient sounds that may not be related to something specifically changing about the game, but will tell us some information about the environment of the game that we're in. Sounds can also be used as cues. So we talked about in level design, we kind of talked about signposting using like literal signs or other ways of kind of telling the player go here or make a choice between these two things. So we can also use sounds to do that. So we can have voiceovers where we have a narrator who just tells the player what to do, or what their options are, or to go one way or another. We can use environmental sounds like footsteps or people talking or a siren or things like that to alert the player to things that are going on in the game, that they might be about to face a challenge or something that they're looking for. They might hear something. And then music is often used as a cue. Sometimes you have background music that's just playing just to have some music, but sometimes music changes. Like in Inside, we had the heartbeat that was getting more and more intense. And in Half-Life, we have the music that triggers at the end of a level. So sometimes music is not just music, but it's also a cue to let us know, oh, you're about to fight a boss, or you're about to discover something that you've been looking for, or something like this. Okay, so that's it. That's all of everything that we're going to talk about with sound today. There's a lot more to go into, and in the labs I explore a lot more as far as how to actually create sounds, find sounds, and then add sounds into Godot. And I do it in a few very specific places, but that doesn't mean those are the only things that you can do for your game in terms of sound. So if you're interested in exploring more, thinking about other places where your game could use sound, that can be a fun way to make your game more immersive and more exciting for somebody. There's a link to a video here that kind of goes over a lot of the same ideas with a lot more examples, so like a ton of examples. So that's a good video to check out if you want to look more at sound in video games. Cool, so it's 5 o'clock, so it's a good time to transition to workshop time. So I'm going to stop recording.